Viewers, thank you for joining us. You're watching our weekly program, Talk to OBN, on OBN Horn of Africa. In this edition today, we'll be talking about this year's Russia-Africa Summit. It has been held on July 27 and 28. Leaders of Africa met their counterpart in St. Petersburg and discussed various issues mainly on trade, investment, peace and security, development, arms and grain supplies. Among the very heralded things, President Vladimir Putin promised to give 50,000 tons of free grain supply to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Central African Republic, Mali, Somalia and Eritrea. I joined by Dr. Konstantinos Brutasfa, a senior policy advisor to the UN, and now he is working for Africa Humanitarian Action. Doctor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
How do you summarize and how do you put your reflection on this year's Russia-Africa Summit?
Well, you see, these summits have been going on for several years now. We have what you call the African Union Summit, where every head of state and government come to Addis Ababa and other cities in Africa. We have the US-Africa Summit, we have the Russia-Africa Summit, and of course other countries have also initiated similar summits like Turkey, UAE and Saudi Arabia. So this is not unique. What makes this unique is the global geopolitics and geoeconomics that we have today. Because now, after the war in Ukraine, the world has literally come into two pieces. We have a bipolar world instead of a single country-led world economy and world politics by the United States. So we see now the emergence of China and Russia on one side, and the United States and the Western Bloc on the other side. So this meeting is very unique, and for Russia, they're looking at getting a global consensus on their justification for the war in Ukraine. And for African countries, their main purpose in this trip was the suspension of the grain deal of the Black Sea. And most African leaders, true to their word, have been raising this issue consistently in this summit, telling President Putin that he must reinitiate the grain initiative from the Black Sea that's been suspended by Russia after its terms of reference was completed. So this is a very significant moment for Africa and a significant moment for Russia.
What makes this Russia-Africa Summit different from other summits? We do have this US-Africa Summit, we do have China-Africa Summit, we do have UAE Africa Summit and others.
Well, you see, traditionally these summits have been a one-way track in which the United States and Russia and Turkey and others would want to exert their influence on the rest of the world. And Africa, having 54 nations, are a substantial amount of number of countries in the United Nations General Assembly. The second thing is Africa is rich in natural resources. It has a tremendous amount of agricultural land. It has a huge resource, water resource, and it has a very young population. As we see, for example, now the Northern Hemisphere, what you call the northern developed nations, are literally running out of labor. So any investment that's going to come is going to come to Africa. So all of them want to establish themselves as a primary friend of the African countries. And what is probably unique is about China, because the Chinese relationship, what you call the FOCAC meetings between China and Africa, are supplemented by a huge amount of resources to the tune of $60 billion at one point in time. So with the Russian one, what makes it different is Russia is looking for international support for its war in Ukraine. The war has now become between Russia and NATO, between Russia and the Western Bloc, and Russia and the what you call the economically developed nations of the world. That includes Japan, Australia, South Korea, and others that have been against this invasion for some time. Most of them are also supplying arms to Ukraine now to fight Russia. So for Russia, this is an important event where this international diplomacy will take roots among 54 nations in Africa. That will be substantive support for the Russian Federation.
This Russia-Ukraine war is a very drastic war ever. Amidst having this conflict with Ukraine, Russia again working on ways how benefit the Russian Federation. Russia coined this BRICS by joining with India, China, that of South Africa and the others. Can we say this, the outbreak of Russia-Ukraine war would be a blessing in disguise for Russia to reclaim the previous communism bloc?
Well, it's difficult to say because, you know, under globalization and during the post-World War II era, there was much of a movement towards democracy. Even Russia itself, you know, President Putin has been elected and re-elected several times to be the prime minister and to be the president of Russia. And most countries are also moving towards that. And the ex-Soviet countries in Eastern Europe are now more or less independent on their own. So that has been the move. And I don't think Russia is trying to bring its hegemony on the Eastern bloc of Europe. But the point is, Russia has been complaining about the Ukraine joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It has been complaining about Ukraine joining the European Union. And by joining NATO, what it means is they're going to set up nuclear facilities inside Ukraine, which is next door to Russia. So Russia, in the Munich security meetings, even President Putin himself has said it so many times that this is a threat to the existence of Russia. When something is an existential threat, the West probably shouldn't have moved in. And pundits in the US, like Henry Kissinger, have been saying this. Don't push Russia into this. So Russia is now having war in Ukraine. It's invading Ukraine because it wants to forestall the possibility of Ukraine being part and parcel of the NATO armistice. So in the end, what happened is the war is happening. It's very sad. It's very unfortunate that the Ukrainian people are going through this havoc, you know. A lot of lives have been lost. Infrastructure has been destroyed. And frankly, if the war continues for one more year, I don't think Ukraine would even survive as a nation. It's going to be very difficult. Nobody wins in a war. And the aftermath of a war in Ukraine would be very, very difficult to rebuild. You can build the buildings again, but the social fabric has been dismantled to a point where you cannot rebuild it in a generation. And therefore, for Russia now, whatever the justification was for the war, is trying to look friends in Asia, is trying to look friends in Latin America, is trying to find friends in Africa. And the majority of these countries have technically at the United Nations General Assembly have said, you know, this is not our business. Our business should be making peace. Our business should be arbitrators between the two. We cannot take sides on this. So I don't think African countries are going to take sides, but African countries are looking for benefit. But other countries are trying to say, listen, we want peace, but we also want the kind of trade relations we had with Russia and Ukraine, principally in terms of food exports, grain exports, vegetable oil exports. And Ukraine, you know, it's the breadbasket of the world, literally, not just Europe. So definitely African countries have been asking for making peace at this conference. I've seen that, especially the president of Congo explicitly said, you have to make peace in Ukraine. And others have gone also as a delegation led by South African President Ramaphosa to be able to talk to Kiev and Moscow. So what we see here in Russia is a two-way thing where African countries are demanding literally the shipment of grain again from the Black Sea, and Russia is trying to find friends among the huge problems, diplomatic challenges it has globally.
Trade, investment, peace and security, development, arms, and this grain supply were among the major discussion points in St. Petersburg. Do you have any development, or do you have anything to substantiate on these discussion points?
Well, you know, Russia is a traditional friend of Africa in a sense. During the independence movement in the continent, Russia has been very active supplying weapons and training to African revolutionaries, to African liberation movement leaders. And by proxy, some of countries like Ethiopia have supplied tremendous amount of military support to South Sudan during the South Sudan War, to Zimbabwe, which technically liberated Zimbabwe from the Smith regime. So the ANC has been supported by Russia, and therefore a lot of African countries look at Russia as a friend. While, for example, most Western countries were supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa and having trade relations with that country, Russia was supporting the liberation movements in Africa. So I see that historical background. For us, for example, in Ethiopia, the Russia-Ethiopia relations, diplomatic relations, is 125 years old. So it's a very long history we have in terms of culture, religion, in terms of student scholarships that went to Russia to study. A lot of medical doctors graduated from there. So Russia is considered a friend, but now the Ukraine war is in the background, and therefore the West will look at the summit with suspicion. Why are African countries going there? And in fact, I hear there were some efforts by the Western powers to deter African countries from going to Russia. But definitely the outcome of this meeting will, number one, be strengthening the relationship between Russia and Africa. Number two, if and when Russia now stops the war, Russia has tremendous resources. It's probably, in terms of reserves, is number one in petroleum products, is number one in minerals like diamond, gold, and other things. It has huge freshwater resources. It has probably 32% of the world's forests, and therefore, with the kind of capacity that Russia has, it will be useful for Africa in terms of sharing experience in development and providing development assistance.
Many African leaders have shown up to St. Petersburg this year, and likewise about 43 African leaders were shown up in Sochi last year. Have you seen any disparity between the discussion points and major agendas and things forwarded from Moscow to Africa, comparatively speaking, with the Sochi and that of St. Petersburg this year's summit?
Well, yes, to some degree. You know, these meetings, their official agenda is always a blanket for other kinds of agenda. And when you talk about this summit, it's about Africa and the country that's inviting them. And definitely, this will show up in the bilateral discussions that you see between heads of states. Otherwise, in the formal meeting, the main agenda is, of course, development, investment, and security issues. But it's not like condemning the West, for example, in Russia. In Sochi, much of the meetings were to have the existing relationship between Russia and Africa cemented under Mr. Putin. Now, Russia needs Africa more than ever because of the international diplomatic environment. We have so many sanctions against Russia now. We have the China-United States Cold War, trade war. So when you look into these issues, I presume the bilateral and closed session agendas would be to look into Russia's support for the Ukraine war, or at least African countries should simply ignore the pressure from the West condemning Russia on this war. And this is a huge diplomatic coup for Russia, because efforts by the West to sway African leaders to condemn Russia have not been very significant in terms of their impact. So for Russia, I think the difference between Sochi and St. Petersburg is that today Russia is in a different situation than it was in 2019. And of course, you know, St. Petersburg is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, so I'm sure African leaders are enjoying it.
Sideline discussions made between some African leaders with that of President Putin. Among others, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed met President Putin and discussed on some unclassified agendas. Do you have any note of it?
I would presume the Horn of Africa would be a paramount discussion. The relationship between the different countries in the Horn of Africa, the security situation in the Horn of Africa. You might know that, you know, Russia is an important player in Sudan now, where we have the Wagner Group also supporting the Hemedis forces. Russia is also very active in Libya, supporting General Haftar, who is moving his troops now in Sudan, actually.
Libya, right?
To complicate the situation in Sudan, he is moving troops in. So the Horn of Africa is in dire straits. Somalia, of course, is getting better now, but for the last 25 years, Somalia has been a failed state. So the kind of situation we have in the Horn of Africa is something that can flare up anytime. So that would be one important issue. The second issue between Ethiopia and Russia would be a kind of development assistance. Now that, you know, the IMF and China are dragging their feet in terms of releasing the debt relief or debt suspension, then the two countries would look into a potential of how Russia could help in this process. Of course, Russia has much of its international reserves that are now in Europe, and the United States have been frozen. So it might not be in a position to be able to give this kind of support. But the traditional kind of things that we've been importing from Russia, especially the equipment that we need in our martial activities, would be definitely a point of discussion there between the two leaders.
Many countries used to request to de-dollarize the U.S. currency. And out of the blue, this BRICS came to those nations as a life savior. How do you put, I mean, the quest for de-dollarization and the emerging of BRICS at this very critical time for the nations which request to throw away these US dollars and use their own in place?
You know, the dollar is a world currency. Historically, this was decided in 1944 at the Bretton Woods meeting in setting up the IMF and the World Bank. At that time, they were trying to look at global currencies that could be effective in literally every country around the world. The British pound was one that had hegemony at the time, but by 1944 the dollar has taken over the British pound in terms of popularity. The second thing, the United States had enough gold reserves to be able to guarantee payments of the dollar. So it was chosen for an international reserve. What happened after 1971 is President Nixon saw that the gold reserves were not matching the amount of dollars in circulation. So if countries demand to send the dollars back to the United States the United States has to pay in gold. So he said, as of now, we're going to float the currency. We're not going to have the gold standard anymore. So the dollar has been hegemonic because of this. Now, when you talk about de-dollarization, there are several issues that come. For one, the dollar is a mighty currency because it's managed by one single country with one political entity. And therefore, it's easier for the United States to manage the dollar. The euro, for example, has more countries and bigger economy than the United States. But the point is the euro doesn't have a unitary political system within which the euro could be confidently trusted by all other countries. That's why it has not taken over as a global currency. So the BRICS might have their own currency, but the difficulty is the BRICS are made of 5 countries with the potential to have 20 more countries. Then it's going to be countries of different political establishments. So this currency cannot have a survival rate. What I would see is a kind of swapping method between the currencies of the BRICS countries, like what Russia and China have done. They have agreed to use the yuan now, the Chinese currency, for trading purposes, because China would be exporting tremendous amount of goods and services to Russia, and Russia is supplying China with the energy requirement it needs, petroleum products, gas products, and other products which have been sanctioned by the West. Traditionally, these were going to Europe. So for me, having a de-dollarization is not going to come very soon. Even the IMF currency that was created couldn't take roots because it was not used as a formal currency to transact between different countries. So it has become just a reserve currency, the SDR. So for me, the most important thing is it's not the actual creation of a new kind of money, but the kind of agreement that you're going to have among the BRICS on how to swap their own currencies without using the dollar. This comes for an important reason, because the United States has been using its dollar hegemony to put sanctions on different countries. So now we're using the dollar, you don't have that kind of liberty to be able to work against the interests of the United States. So we have several countries under sanction. For example, Sudan was under sanction for a long period of time. Iran is under sanction for a long period of time. Russia is now under sanctions. So these kind of sanctions that are being flaunted by the United States Congress or by the US President are of concern to these countries. And therefore they would like to use other means to be able to transfer money among themselves. They might even choose to go back to gold standard, because now gold prices have risen so high. It's in anticipation that the dollar might not be an effective mechanism for trading anymore. And of course you have the role of the World Trade Organization here. How is it going to look into this? And with China also growing as the #1 economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity, what is going to be the effect of the Chinese currency on the world economy? Is China planning to replace the dollar completely with its own currency? And China might have the ability to do this because Africa-China trade is at its highest now, while the US-Africa trade is going down. So for me, these are things that we would have to wait and see after the BRICS meeting in South Africa, what kind of decisions they're going to undertake and what are the kind of mechanisms they're going to put in place to be able to have a currency swap or even creating a new currency among the BRICS themselves.
Many countries are still very desperate to join the BRICS, and among others, Ethiopia is one of these countries. What is the merit and demerit of joining BRICS for Ethiopia? Joining BRICS wouldn't spoil Ethiopia's relation with the US and with the Europe?
Well, you see, if you take, for example, the 2 biggest trade partners in the world are China and the United States. they have problems between themselves. These are concerning, one, the kind of trade balance you have between the two countries. Number two is the issue of Taiwan, which President Xi has said we will bring Taiwan either through peaceful negotiations or by force. And the United States doesn't want this. They want to protect Taiwan. The third thing is China has claimed the South China Sea as its own sea. And there are many other countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, have claims on the South China Sea. And the United States wants the South China Sea to be an open international waterway in which every country would benefit from it. So even with this kind of relationship, they are still the biggest trading partners. And we should understand very well that joining BRICS doesn't mean anything for the United States. We have several congregations of trade relationships with your country. You have the African Free Continental Trade Area, you have the Mercosur in Latin America, you have the NAFTA in, they have changed the name now, in North America. So these are trade agreements. They're not going to be military pacts between these countries, because I doubt if Brazil and Russia, Brazil and China would want a military pact, because Brazil is juxtaposed next to the United States in terms of its proximity, and it's also trade relations. So for us, joining BRICS is not going to create any problems. The fact is the United States Ethiopia diplomatic relations have to be maintained with adequate capacity, erudite diplomats, and we have to explain ourselves to the United States. In fact, the United States has now taken several measures to take Ethiopia out of the United States human rights sanctions. The United States is still one of the biggest donors to Ethiopia. Last year, they poured in $1.6 billion into this country, and therefore it's only the capacity of our diplomats and leaders to engage the United States that's more important than joining BRICS.
Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. This brings us to the end of our edition for today. See you next time with another edition. Bye-bye.